Welcome to day 3 of London's Digital Conference Week. I'm Anna O'Deedon, Head of Knowledge at Future of London, and all this week, with thanks to our fantastic sponsors, so that's Arup, Lansec, Montague Evans and Pollard Thomas Edwards, we're hosting a series of webinars and workshops exploring how the public and the private sectors can work together to achieve our net zero ambitions. Just for those of you who aren't familiar with us, at Future of London, we're an independent network and we support those who work in planning, housing, regen and economic development. And what we really do well is we bring both the public and the private sectors from across London and the globe together in order to discuss the big issues that's keeping the built environment professionals awake at night. We're also really big believers in making sure that knowledge and ideas are spread as far and wide as possible. So please do share what we're up to with your friends, your colleagues. You can see the Twitter handle on the screen now. It's at Future of LDN, or you can use our conference hashtag #NetZeroLDM. The other thing I'd like to mention is that we are keen to make this conference about solutions and practical next steps. And so in addition to those 2 social media tags, we're also inviting you to celebrate your own personal or organisational net zero ambitions. And you can do this by tweeting us using the hashtag #NetZeroAmbition. If you're in the seminar yesterday, I shared my own, which is to use our local refill shop much more often than I do currently. So just a simple thing, but I'd be really interested to see your personal net zero ambitions or indeed your organisational net zero ambitions for 2021. So do let us know about those. Anyway, on to today. We are going to be considering how we make these net zero ambitions a reality. And in order to do this, we need to discuss how we're going to fund climate change. And so today we're going to hear from practitioners from across the globe. We're going to think about the financial tools that are available, where the funding gaps lie, and also those challenges that we face. And I guess we should be clear that achieving net zero is tricky for lots of reasons. One of those is certainly that there is a financial cost of taking action. But we do need to balance this with the cost of not addressing climate change. And we also need to think about the implications for communities and the planet if we don't take action quickly enough. And so we're going to be talking about the cost of inaction too. To help us with that, next slide please, we're going to be joined by 5 brilliant speakers from across the globe. And it is my pleasure to welcome Feliz Ventura, Malcolm Hanna, Letitia Pancrazi, Bevan Jones and Felicity Scott. Shortly, each speaker is going to be sharing their view on funding net zero, and then we'll move on to a panel discussion and audience Q&A. So there's lots of opportunities for you, the audience, to get involved. You can do it in 3 ways. The first is to use the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen. Just click in there and you can type in a question that's directed specifically at the panel or a particular panelist. And when we get to that point in today's session, I'll read out your question and we'll have an audience Q&A panel discussion there. If you could remember to put your name and your organisation in with your Q&A, that would be great, so I can credit you when I read those out. The other way that you can get involved is using our chat stream, which if you click on the chat button at the bottom of the screen, you can share your own ideas, your own insights and learnings there. Please do, if it is working, I've just seen a chat saying it might not be, but if it is working, then please do get involved there. It's really interesting to see kind of parallel discussions that audience members are having between themselves. And to our panelists, please do jump in if there's anything that you would like to contribute there as well. But just a reminder, keep your specific Q&As for the panel discussion in the Q&A box. And of course, you can tweet too using hashtag #NetZeroLDM. All right, so let's get cracking with our speakers. To start us off today, we're joined by Feliz Ventura, Director of Sustainable Economics at Hatch. And Feliz joins us all the way from California, where, like I say, it's very bright and early for her there. In California, Feliz spends her working hours making the business case for climate adaptation. And we are really grateful she's able to join us and delighted that she's able to share her lessons from the critical work she does at Hatch. So over to you, Feliz.
Thank you so much for that great introduction. And I'm so thrilled to be here today with you all. So let's talk about California's climate lessons for funding. Next slide, please. We're going to dig right in and start with, why does California matter? Well, let's start with the economy. It's pretty large for a state. It's about $3.2 trillion. And if you don't really know how much $3.2 trillion is, it's just a hair larger than the UK's about $2.6 trillion economy. On top of that, California is one of the most biodiverse regions in the world. Now, the recipe that made California into this large economy was actually built on the natural resources of the state, starting all the way back with the complex indigenous societies that thrived here for millennia, through to the gold miners who emigrated in the 1840s, then the agricultural bounty that led to a global trade and financial hub in California, which then created the investment in technology that booms in the state today. But as the climate changes, we're beginning to clearly see the price tag of climate change. Every climate event in California is expensive because it is such an economically productive area, and these costs will become quite significant, as you can see in the figure. This means that we can clearly see the costs of inaction across a wide variety of economic activity and landscapes, and hopefully then derive lessons that are usable in other parts of the world. Next slide. Okay, let's talk about the lessons from California. So given the high costs of climate change here, we've taken an integrated approach to climate, economic, and social risk and the study of these risks, which often results in innovative policies, such as the creation of a state working group on climate adaptation with specific reference to social equity, joining the UN Sustainable Insurance Forum, and the development of a state-level cap and trade market. Note, all of this was done 5 years ago and before, so maybe none of it sounds that radical today, but at the time that these actions were taken, they were really innovative policies. It's worth noting that when you implement policies like cap and trade on a strong financial base, you create an environment where funding can actually be sourced and channeled back into GHG reduction. However, there are also lessons in the context of challenges here, which include challenges around a historic lack of investment in infrastructure, really a lot of jurisdictions across the state that have acted really independently in the past, but now that need to come together to plan more at the ecosystem scale and even beyond to get to net zero. The need for equitable access to data that drives decision-making around investments and insurance in the context of climate, as well as structural constraints on taxation that makes it very difficult to raise money for all of these new needs. Next slide. Okay, let's dig in here a bit on funding. So usually when I talk about this topic, I start out with a big word cloud of buzzwords, and undoubtedly you've all heard a lot of jargon in the context of both funding, finance, as well as climate. But my main point here is that the mechanics are actually pretty simple, particularly in a public context. You start out by raising money from people, and this is the key first step. Once you have the money, there's a lot of options for financing. I've noted two of the major approaches for financing highlighted here: bonds and loans, with some considerations for climate-related and climate-responsive infrastructure investment. There's a lot of other mechanisms that fall in there, but it's important to remember that most of those new mechanisms really are financing mechanisms, not funding mechanisms. After borrowing, money gets spent and paid back over time. There's also a public-private approach, which I think we'll get into more in the conversation, but we'll just flag here that, of course, when private capital is involved, there needs to be a return to that capital, which then needs to be balanced against the public benefit that is delivered by that investment. Next slide. So, challenges. I just said this was all pretty straightforward, and that's true from a mechanics perspective, but that isn't the real world. In the real world, there are trade-offs, which means limited funding, and remember that funding is the crucial first step, dueling priorities, and in the case of 2020, a global pandemic that has had major economic implications for us. This means that for every investment made, the calculus around how this particular money advances our goals, not only related to net zero, but for other social and economic imperatives, has to figure just so to justify the funding. This is a really hard problem. And to illustrate just how hard, I built a board game that puts you into the shoes of different people in a community that needs to fund these particular social, economic, and climate adaptive investments. Here's a snapshot of people playing the game, and they're just at the beginning, which is why they're still smiling. Next slide, please. So, solutions. I'll leave you on an optimistic note. There are a lot of things that we can do to push for solutions around funding and financing for net zero. And because finance is global, a lot of these recommendations are also transferable globally. There's a lot here, and I want to preserve some time for discussion, so I won't go into almost any of these, but I'll highlight that there has been a lot of momentum around disclosure of climate risk. This is great, and it's an excellent building block, but there's been less around examining the costs and benefits of specific investments, policies, and other interventions that would help us not just understand what investments are risky, which is what disclosure does, but what benefits investments bring, which is the information that we need to justify the dedication of that funding itself. All right, thanks to you all, and I look forward to the discussion coming up.
Thank you so much, Phyllis. That was brilliant and such a great insight from California. I think lots of lessons for everyone here in London, because of course we have our city perspective, we have our borough perspective, but we're a piece in the jigsaw of the wider picture too. So really great to hear some of your solutions, and I look forward to perhaps hearing a bit more about the board game in the chat. Very intriguing. We're now moving on to Malcolm Hanna, Sustainability Manager at Legal & General Investment Management. Malcolm will be sharing with us his private sector perspective on funding net zero and the cost of inaction. So Malcolm, I'll hand over to you now. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everybody. Yes, great to be with you. So I'm Malcolm Hanna, Sustainability Manager for L&G Real Assets. I'm going to share with you some of our experiences from the commercial property sector on the path to net zero, just to add that it's work in progress. We definitely haven't achieved it yet. If I could have the next slide, please. So a little bit of background. We have around 800 real estate assets, many types, including offices, shopping centres, logistics, industrial estates. And we've recently come to the end of a 10-year carbon reduction target cycle, so reducing our emissions by 20% through active sustainability management. So last year we started working on our targets for the next 10 years and beyond. So we set ourselves science-based targets out to 2030, and then to achieve net zero carbon by 2050. So some of our funds are looking to accelerate the pathway, but that's our overarching aim. Now, it's just worth noting that these targets represent probably reductions in the region of 60% in terms of our carbon intensity. So they're significant and they're very challenging. Next slide, please. So in terms of what we've been working on over the past 12 months to help us get there, just to highlight some of the key areas, we've drafted, for example, new net zero briefs and guidance for our new developments and refurbishments. We've put in place new enhanced due diligence to take net zero audits for when we're buying new properties. And we've also launched a range of pilot projects to help us really understand things like the costs and the risks and the opportunities associated with net zero, and also to start to work out how best to work with our supply chain in implementing what we need to do. And finally, we've also invested in a new monitoring and targeting reporting platform to give us a location for lots of the new data streams that we need to be pulling together, and also for new information we need to report. Next slide, please. So I mentioned the pilots, and they've revealed quite a lot of specific sort of technical insights for us. For example, our refurbishments would typically deliver carbon reduction savings of 20 to 30%, and obviously we need to go much further. I think the key messages though for us are really around the importance of intervention opportunities, so such as refurbishments and leasing events, because although we can achieve quite a lot through operational improvements and some of the lighter touch measures, to make the really deep cuts that I've mentioned, in many cases requires significant work on site, building fabric, interventions, major plants. And for those, often we require a void period for properties. And I think what they've also highlighted to us, the pilots, is the real need to engage with our occupiers. So in a sense, we can't do this on our own as landlords. Our occupiers can't do it on their own either. So we have to really collaborate, and we've started a range of work in that area now. Next slide, please. So just very briefly on drivers. So there's a range of drivers. I was asked to touch on some legislation. So last year we had the government making a national commitment to achieve net zero by 2050. So in general, we should be expecting increasing regulation as we move forwards. There's two pieces of interest to us, but I'll just focus in terms of the commercial sector on the second area, which is the minimum energy efficiency standard. So This actually prescribes the energy EPC, the energy performance ratings that buildings must achieve in order to be let. Currently, they need to be at least an E. Last year, the government consulted on actually increasing this requirement and is minded to introduce a new requirement for C or B over the next 10 years. So I've just shown the chart below. We did a bit of work about 18 months ago. The blue horizontal bars show the performance, the real life performance, measured performance of a sample of our offices. And the horizontal bar, the red bar shows the EPC C rating, if you like. And then the bottom grey bar is actually what a B represents. And interestingly, the B is the level that is approximately net zero carbon. So that's that's what we're trying to get to. Now, our properties generally fare pretty well against our competitors. We benchmark them every year. So, I think this probably indicates, in a sense, the size of the task facing the whole sector to move us to net zero. So if I could just move on to the next slide, please. So in terms of investments in net zero, so investment and the cost of net zero, just say at the moment, there are very few net zero buildings in the UK. So there's limited data out there. UK GBC last month published some figures for new build. They estimate the cost premium for net zero for offices is between 6 and 17%, for residential between maybe 3 and 5%. As I mentioned earlier, the timing of the interventions is key in this. So get in now during, for example, a refurbishment. A lot can be saved in terms of additional cost compared with having to intervene at a later stage. So those interventions are key. We can also regard, in many ways, these costs as a risk mitigation. So get in sooner to avoid, if you like, and to reduce the impact of legislative risks such as MEES that I've just mentioned. Somebody like us, the ability to let our properties is obviously at the heart of our business. So we need to try and act now to mitigate some of those legislative risks. I'd just say, in addition to the costs, there's a range of benefits to set against them, including things like reputation. So we've got an increasing raft of requests from our investors and our clients asking for information about what we're doing about ESG, what we're doing about net zero. And there's also growing evidence that green buildings deliver better financial outcomes in terms of things like void rates and the returns on investment for those properties. So just really a couple of final points. In terms of carbon and climate change, we need to think about physical risk. Our use of historic data to predict the future is no longer sufficient. So we, along with others, have been developing some new models to help us predict emerging risks and inform resilience plans. Final point really is just to say that the whole of this net zero piece needs to be incorporated into investment strategy. So this is not about add on and garnish. The investments, the risks, the returns that I've outlined are significant, and they need to be embedded now in order to enable this big transition to be managed over the next years. So thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you so much, Malcolm. Some really interesting points. There are loads to pick up on in the Q&A. Certainly, I'm interested in hearing a little bit more about how you convince your supply chain to get on board so that you're all pulling in the same direction. And also, I'm keen to talk a little bit more about increasing regulation and what more the private sector would welcome. Let's move on now to the public sector. We work with Letitia Prankazi from Useful Projects. She is going to be sharing with us her fascinating work, which looks at how the public sector is looking to fund the transition to net zero over the next couple of years. So over to you.
Thank you, Anna. Hi, everyone. I'm really delighted to be here today, and I'll be presenting some of the key findings from our Financing Climate Action Report. We've just launched today a summary report, and the report will be here in November. Next, please. Next again. So we've been looking at the 6 key enablers to help local authorities deliver on their climate action pledge and accelerate their journey to net zero carbon. Today, I'll be focusing on 2 of these key themes, but just quickly touching on the 4 other enablers. Capacity building and upskilling is key to ensure that you are embedding sustainability across your entire organization and reducing the cost of delivering low carbon projects. We've also looked at tools and tips to unlock more external funding, particularly around blended finance, increasing fundraising capacity, and lobbying powers of local authorities. We've also looked at alternative delivery models and using economies of scale to scale up retrofitting endeavors. And we've looked at maximizing collaboration, particularly around innovation-led projects, as well as knowledge sharing. Next. So today I wanted to talk about the importance of building a total value business case. And in our report, we look at 3 different tools, but today I want to discuss whole life costing. Whole life costing looks at the cost of a project from its inception all the way through its operation. And for local authorities, it's particularly interesting in 2 different cases. The first one is when you are retrofitting your own buildings, the buildings that you are occupying, because it allows you to balance the additional capital investment required in retrofitting with operational savings, namely through reduced energy bills or revenues through solar panels that would generate income. The second one is around investing in renewable energy projects or electric vehicle projects. There is a bit of a perception that these projects are sunk in cost, but actually they are becoming more and more beneficial with increased return on investments. For example, solar panels have decreased in cost, solar batteries are 80% cheaper than they used to be, and you're now looking at return on investment of 3 to 12 years with additional revenues through additional systems like the smart energy export. Next. So I also want to talk a little bit about delivering low carbon development and the myth that this is going to lead to increasing cost uplift. Through the research that we've done and interviews with on-the-ground officers, we found that delivering zero carbon homes or low carbon homes can actually be cost neutral. And this can be done in 5 different ways. First, it's the famous upskilling. If sustainability and delivering low carbon homes become routine, you can actually achieve zero carbon homes at no cost uplift. And this was the case for Exeter City Council. If you are engaging your supply chain early on and embedding sustainability from the beginning of your design process, once again, you can reduce cost. For example, adopting circular or lean design approach means you can reduce embodied carbon at no additional cost. Spatial planning is also your friend, particularly when you look at density and massing. This allows you to maximize land value and minimize land uptake, which allows you to protect some of the valuable green spaces. Good design also allows you to reduce cost, particularly in saving spaces, or for example, through massing and orientation, you can have quick win around passive design, which delivers tremendous social value to your residents. And finally, economies of scales are really important. Certain quantums of development allow you to reduce cost throughout your entire supply chain. Next. I think what was surprising about our research is that financing climate action is about much more than just money. It's about capacity building, collaboration, and creativity. So I wanted to finish my talk today with easy little tips that local authorities can do now to increase their capacity in delivering climate action. Around capacity building, local authorities can do skills audit to determine which skills they have in-house and which one they need to invest in. A quick win is to make sure that you have passive design skills within your design team, especially around passive house, to ensure that these elements are embedded in your design proposal early on, avoiding cost uplifts which hinder viability of projects. You should also look at breaking down silos within local authorities and promoting a working group culture. I know this can be really hard, but it brings a lot of benefits, embedding sustainability throughout an entire organization. And then around collaboration, share your knowledge internally and externally through industry forums or any platform that allow you to share these and re-embed your learnings into future projects. Also, co-design, you are only in charge of a certain amount of carbon emissions within your borough, so make sure that you're involving communities and businesses. And finally, around creativity, really embrace innovation. Demonstrator projects can be more expensive, but through standardized options, you can actually reduce cost. And alternative delivery models and financing mechanisms still remain unused. So talk to your finance department about using green bonds and other innovative mechanisms, as well as looking into these new investment opportunities. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you so much. And what a positive message that good design reduces cost. I'm really delighted to hear that. What an incentive. Let's move on now to Bevan Jones. Bevan joins us from Santander, and he's spent the last 15 years working in climate change. He's a risk specialist with over 15 years experience helping organisations prepare for climate change in a low carbon future. So welcome, Bevan.
Hi everyone. I've just got one slide, and what I'm going to talk about today is we are in a world where we are focusing on net zero. And obviously people are trying to, particularly in the built environment, trying to understand the cost of net zero. So I'm going to talk about something slightly different, which is, if I go to my slide, please, the cost of actual climate change, which I think often gets forgotten in the debate around net zero, because net zero is generally focused on the mitigation, whereas actually there is some adaptation that needs to take place. And again, in the context of net zero, people talk about the transition risk, you know, the risk of changing from business as usual to something which is extremely low carbon, but often don't focus very much on the physical risk and what that costs and what it's going to cost to stop that, because there is already a certain amount of climate change which our built environment is going to experience. I did put it in, but you can find this. I was going to put this in, but you can find this picture online, so I don't have to. There's a very famous picture of some Tesla power banks, some charging points that are under about 2 foot of water. So we've done the mitigation without then thinking of the adaptation. If you Google that image, you'll find it quite easily on the internet. And I just want to highlight that actually physical climate change has a real life and a financial cost. So this is from the EU 28 countries, these figures, between 1980 and 2017. And these are the list of climate-related events. Now, geophysical is things like earthquake and volcano, so you can imagine Italy in that space. So really we're after meteorological, hydrological, climatological events. And you can see here that something that isn't priced into our efforts to get to net zero or to tackle climate change is the human cost of heatwave events. Over that period from 1980, there were around 90,000 fatalities, 85% of which are attributable to heat wave. When you go on to the next pie chart on this slide, there is over 500 billion cost in terms of total losses. Now that is losses which are insured and uninsured. So you can imagine those people who are in high flood risk zones or zones where they have not insured their buildings are going to be left, homeless without any long-term solution. When we go to insured losses, obviously the number is smaller, but you can see that the impact in terms of what the insurance industry is going to be stumping up for from these events is extremely high. So what I want to get across is the fact that we need to start pricing in the risk of climate change and the risk of solving that climate change. And as a subset of that, I just want to add around the risk of error. I've spent a lot of time trying to think of a better phrase for it. But as we know in the built environment in the UK and in the supply chain for low carbon, that some of these areas in the supply chain, particularly social housing providers will have experienced this. Some of the supply chain within these low carbon solutions is really immature. And we have seen poor installation, poor operation, or shortened lifespans for equipment, which is labelled low carbon. So I just want to make people aware that these are the types of sophisticated mapping and modelling that we should be looking at. Is not just the cost of getting to net zero, but the cost of getting to net zero and hitting some speed bumps, but also the cost of net zero plus the cost of realising that we're already within quite a steady phase of changing climate, whether that's heat waves, flooding, drought, or excess downpour rainfall events. That's it for me.
Thanks, Bevan. And certainly a really important message not to lose sight of the fact that climate change has already begun. And I think it links certainly to how we started today's presentations from Feliz saying that there is a price tag associated with climate change and associated with all of the climate events that are happening in California right now. I guess the message is that it's also happening in London, it's happening in the UK. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to picking that up as we move into the Q&A session. So reminder to everyone in the audience, please do pop your questions in the Q&A box, but do keep chatting about more general conversational matters in the chat. Let's move on now to our last but not least presentation from Felicity Scott. She is accents producer at Poplar Harker, and Felicity is going to talk to us about the Funding Net Zero challenge from a housing association perspective. So over to you, Felicity.
Wonderful. Afternoon, everyone, and delighted to be here. So thank you for having me. As Anna said, I work at Poplar Harker. We're a housing, regeneration and community association in East London, and we have around 10,000 homes, to give you an idea of our scale. Today, I'm going to touch on the financial environment facing RSLs at the moment, and then share some examples of how we've tried to embed sustainability in the way that we manage our communities. So to start with, we're at the very beginning of our net zero journey, and we've started with an assessment of our 1920 carbon footprint, and we're looking at the best ways for us to reduce our business emissions, and by that I mean all the things that we pay for, so our offices, our communal spaces and our fleet to start with. And we feel that we may find that we're going to be able to achieve net zero in a business sense relatively easily at relative low cost and in advance of 2050, which at that point would make you think that we're ready to kind of slap ourselves on the back for a job well done. But of course we recognise that the real challenge lies in how we're going to decarbonise our stock and how we're going to ensure an equitable future for our communities so that those benefits and burdens of net zero are shared by all. Next slide, please. As I said then, the financial environment facing RSLs at the moment, it's a tough one. Nationally, we know that 80% of the homes that we're going to be living in 2050 already exist. And if we're going to meet the challenge of increasing both their energy efficiency and decarbonising heat, we know that deep retrofit is going to be essential to this. Next slide, please. Done right, retrofit will help us address issues of fuel poverty and other health inequalities brought about by poor housing. But how will we fund this? Unfortunately, at Poplar Harker, we don't have the answer to that just yet. Along with all the other RSLs, we're in an environment with a 4% reduction in our rent since 2016 and the economic uncertainty caused by COVID-19. So the two most recent announcements of funds from central government haven't exactly inspired us with the confidence that that funding gap that we see is going to be met. That, in addition to the fact that whilst the carbon agenda is a significant priority, it's not the only one that requires a huge amount of investment. I mean, first and foremost, we have the post-Grenfell fire standards, where it's estimated implementation will be between 6 and 10 billion. And then the anticipated impact this will have on expenditure for us to deliver on our second priority, which is building new affordable homes. Next slide, please. So as I said at the beginning, we are a housing and regeneration association. So we really want to utilise the opportunities afforded by large-scale estate renewal so that we can absorb the cost of building better and efficient homes into that development stage. But we're also developing programmes so that we can recycle assets that are not ready for reletting. We can take those disposal proceeds and we can buy new affordable homes through Section 106. And we're able to do this at a rate of 1.5 new homes for every home sold. Equally, through our regeneration ballots, we have really developed a strong resident base, and we want to continue to engage with them so that we can have a truly community-led estate renewal programme, but also we can embed that transition to net zero in the early stages. And then through master planning, we have ambitions to strengthen walking and cycling connections on our new estates. And we're heavily advocating with our strategic partners through school streets, livable neighbourhoods, and major infrastructure projects to do this. Next slide, please. So as I said at the beginning, we are trying to embed sustainability in our everyday practices. So we want to be able to raise our own awareness of other built environment priorities, and so that we can capitalise on the funding available for those. So examples of where we've done that already are through applying for funds to address air quality issues in Poplar Harker. We've been able to look internally at our own behaviour, and through that we have now funded a fleet of e-cargo bikes for our staff and supported our estate services team to use electrical equipment. We've also been able to install over 6,000 solar panels across our estates and created a community interest company so we can channel all the profits back into our communities. And they may seem like small efforts, but when combined together, our approach is to seed the conversation of sustainability into our communities. And to the final slide, thank you. For example, we're working with a design and architecture collective who have been engaged in our community on circular economy principles, and they're also trying to develop a sustainable energy model through food waste collection and anaerobic digestion. Simply, we would not have these skills within Poplar Harker, so we're looking to continue to leverage our role as a community anchor and strategic partner so that we can advocate for such issues and we can build the partnerships required. So I guess what I would like you to take away from this afternoon is that once we get past the relatively easy stuff of reducing our business emissions, we nonetheless face a significant funding challenge in terms of retrofit. That requires a lot more thinking and support from the government. However, I hope to also have shown you some opportunities to take a whole systems approach to ensure a just and equitable future, so that we can address other issues like waste, mobility, infrastructure, skills, jobs and well-being, and create a truly holistic and coherent strategy to net zero. Thank you.
Thank you, Felicity. And yeah, a very important and clear message that we need to take a whole systems approach to thinking about the funding net zero challenge that lies ahead of us. So let's move now on to a panel discussion and audience Q&A. I invite all of the panelists to turn their videos and their microphones back on and join me on stage, as it were. I've got a few questions, but I can also see there's plenty coming through in the Q&A, so I'll do my very best to get to each of them, and apologies in advance if I don't quite manage that. I'd like to kick off thinking about, I suppose, the context of today. A few of you, so Felicity, as well as others, you mentioned COVID-19 and the global pandemic as being a lens through which to look at the current situation, and a question really about what we've learned from the last couple of months is thinking about the recovery from COVID-19. You know, green and net zero clearly is a part of that. So my question is twofold. The first part is what has been the impact of COVID-19 on the existing financial mechanisms that we already had in place? And then the other part of that, and I think this links to Felicity and perhaps also to what you were mentioning, Bevan, we've seen that COVID-19 has affected different communities in different ways. If we needed another reminder, COVID-19 certainly has been that there's a disproportionate impact on low-income communities. So how can we, with the net zero ambition in mind, ensure that no community is left behind and that funding is distributed in an equal way, that the burden isn't just left on particular communities? So over to the panelists. If you'd like to jump in with a response, please do raise your hand and I'll come to you in turn. Anyone who wants to kick us off? Feliz, and then Felicity. So Feliz.
Okay. I'll be quick here. You know, obviously COVID-19 has had impacts on revenues and the ability to undertake these projects, but there's still reason to be optimistic here, because one of the things that this constriction of revenues has done is really force us to think about what are our priorities and what are our needs and how can we deliver multi-benefit projects in ways that are efficient. So it really has forced us, and we can see this a lot in California, to think about, well, this is the way we were planning to spend this money before, but is this really the best way to spend the remaining money that we have? How can we get as much bang for the buck out of every single buck? Because we have fewer now, but we also have a very strong focus on not only climate risks, but social and equity challenges that we need to confront with these limited dollars. So overall, I would say, you know, it's a challenging situation, but there's reason for optimism because there's been a full reframing of the conversation around how we should be spending the money and how we should be measuring the benefits we get from that money.
Thanks. Let's go to you, Felicity.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, I think the impact is still so unknown. And so we're taking a very prudent position where, you know, we've had to put a hold on certain capital works that we would have normally have done. So we just don't know yet what the full impact will be. So that means it's very hard to do all the forward planning, and in particular with some funds I mentioned that have come forward from central government, they require match funding, and that's just not a position we see ourselves as being in at the moment. But I would echo other comments made around about refocusing on value for money and looking for multiple benefits from every pound spent, and that refocusing on how inequality is affecting the most vulnerable in our communities, and that's often going to be our residents and our states.
Okay. Bevan, do you want to jump
yeah,
in?
I think just Anna, just referring to kind of what you were saying about community there, I think what climate change is doing is, and we're not there yet because political action has generally been fairly slow in the area, but what we're seeing is a change in thinking of what's needed in order to form solutions to keep societies kind of going. Now, what I mean by that is, you know, if it rains a bit more, it doesn't mean society is going to break down. But what it means is we have to look at different ways of supporting those who are most vulnerable. So there is some, there was a survey done, I think, by one of the large estate agents, which basically said that 25% of properties in London don't have buildings insurance. Now, if we're in the case and you're vulnerable and you live in a building without buildings insurance, if you take this down to the nth degree, if you get flooded, you don't have access to credit, you don't have access to insurance. Your next step is to go to someone like a loan shark and get that money in a different way, so that you can rebuy your white goods and restock your flats essentially, or your home. Now, I think what we need to do is look at different models of how we provide some kind of community level products, whether that's community buildings insurance or community home insurance, whatever, however you want to frame it. But I think the traditional ways that we have run our kind of economies will have to probably change. And, you know, touching on something that Malcolm said beforehand, it's quite hard to find examples of net zero buildings. Well, it's quite hard to find examples of net zero organizations. And yes, you can get your emissions down to whatever, and you can offset the rest, and you can do, but actually a true net zero organization is not going to look like most of the organizations that exist today. It will have different ways of collecting data, it will have different ways of using that data and of making decisions, whereby the climate will be a major part of those decisions, which it currently isn't in a lot of organizations. So I think we will have to develop, and this will take a bit of work, I don't think it's just going to be a bright idea and then it gets implemented. We will have to develop slightly different ways of looking at how we deal with vulnerability and communities in the light of climate change.
Great, thanks. Malcolm or Letitia, do you
Yes.
want to? Yeah, Malcolm.
Yes, certainly. Happy to. I mean, I think just a couple of things really. I think on a kind of positive note in terms of what's perhaps come out of the you know the COVID period, is the ability for us to do things differently, our ability to adapt and change. So it's been really interesting, you know, in that sense, and particularly in my area. So I've been working in kind of, you know, energy carbon associated with properties for many years. You know, the fact that we've actually moved to home working, reduced travel, reduced emissions associated with travel, reduced emissions associated with you know, large building projects, etc. I think that there are some positive messages there, and I agree with the last point about the fact that we're moving into a different phase, and organisations will need to do things very differently. And I think there's messages for us there. I mean, I think in terms of when we think about you know, some of the negative aspects associated with the economic impact. I mean, I'll just make the point as well from my perspective in terms of buildings and energy and carbon. You know, if anything, some of the things that have been a challenge in the past are going to be even more of a challenge in the future. So I think about things like fuel poverty, the pressures on businesses and organisations to reduce their costs over the next period. So if anything, you know, the need for us to try to make our buildings more usable, more efficient, more energy efficient, lower running costs associated with them, you know, is going to be even more important during this next period, I think.
Great, thank you. Yeah, Letitia.
Just again, trying to answer at different points, so sorry, but the first thing was around how to address the social justice element of delivering climate funds. And I think in the fundraising sphere, they're looking at participatory grant making and giving much more of a decision about how the money is used to local communities, and particularly vulnerable local community that will have a better understanding of where that money can have the biggest impact. And for now, there's been a lot of that, particularly actually in California, in terms of being delivered, but it hasn't really yet made its way to the UK. And this is something that we're exploring, is how can money have less of these restrictions or a specific guidance, which often don't actually apply to the local context, and help address some of these inequalities. And then just building on the notion of data, it's going to be really important that we find ways of measuring these additional benefits beyond just the carbon reduction, which we are becoming better at measuring and at valuing. All the health benefits, reducing fuel poverty, all these measurements that are quite hard to quantify financially. I'm hoping that organizations are able to build models where we take that into account, and when we assess a project, we can actually see the long-term value of delivering climate action.
Great, thanks everyone. And somewhat related to this topic of conversation, we have a question from Nick James from Future Grounds, who asks, are there any examples of occupant health and wellbeing benefits that are being factored into the cost to the value side of the equation? I'm not sure if there are any examples. Maybe it's a bit like Malcolm's comment, there's not very many net zero buildings currently. But does the panel have any references?
Yeah, I mean, sorry, come back in again. You know, I think our view is actually when we're thinking about net zero, we're not actually just thinking about net zero on its own, and there's some fairly basic reasons for that. So we tend to think of and try to think about net zero carbon, health and well-being, and also social impact. Really, the three sort of pillars. Because obviously, you know, you could basically you could make a building that was extremely low energy, you know, had zero windows, etc. But obviously it wouldn't be very, very healthy or comfortable for you to live in. It'd be very low energy. So we're trying to balance those three things, I think. So in terms of health and well-being, there are good examples. I say good examples. I'd say the health and well-being in buildings is still in its relative infancy in terms of data that's been gathered. But there is movement in terms of people trying to take this forward, and also coming on the back of things like requirements around COVID. So we've got things about, like, you know, the use of natural daylight, the ability for people to actually get good quality air in buildings, which has been a problem, you know, for a long time. You know, there's a range of areas that are increasingly coming onto the agenda when people are looking at what's required in terms of new ways of delivering these types of buildings, really.
Okay, thank you. Letitia, you look like you wanted to jump in there. And then is there any other panelists? Let me know with a raise of a hand.
I think to answer Nick's question, there's no, at least that I'm not aware of, models that directly quantify it into the financial, and if anyone knows one, please do share it. But there are models that are trying to increase the value of health and well-being. So for example, I saw someone posted a link to the donut economy, but we also have things around the social capital models that look at quantifying these values. You have the BRE home quality mark, Build for Life Happy, and all of these will provide points or quantify or provide proxies for measuring the health benefits.
Great, thank you. Feliz, it looked like you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say I concur with the rest of the panelists that at the building scale, these things are very difficult to get a handle on in terms of modeling, but the modeling becomes much more powerful at, say, a regional or a broader level, where you can actually capture some of the public health benefits that actually return to the economies and the businesses and the communities that exist there. And that modeling around the connection to sort of generalized public health and economic benefits has been done. So that exists. But I think the next step is really thinking about how do we get these back down to those finer scales. And in the absence of that, doing exactly what Malcolm was talking about, which is linking those benefits up with other activities and other benefits that are already priced in, or that get priced in more directly.
Great, thank you very much. I've got a few specific questions that I'm going to direct at various panelists now coming in from the Q&A. So this one is for Felicity from Jack Dunmore. Apologies, Jack, I'm not sure which organisation you're from. He is very interested in your topic of conversation because he's working on an NHS project currently, and as part of the regeneration programme. They are looking to understand monitoring of cradle to grave carbon. Excuse me, I'm reading live and trying to shorten at the same time. Notes that one of the largest producers of carbon is in new construction and regeneration, and as such, refurbishment of property is more carbon positive. And was just hoping for your reflections on that, please.
Yeah, I mean, you've definitely hit up on the inherent tension, Jack, in how we can view regeneration as a wonderful opportunity to really design in the infrastructure we're going to need for a net zero future, and we can also use it as an opportunity to embed those behaviours with our residents at an early stage, because they're helping us to design these neighbourhoods and spaces and their homes. But yes, in the course of demolition and construction, we're creating more carbon emissions. So we have two estates that have been through the ballot. They're at slightly different phases, and what we want to do next is kind of understand that whole life cycle analysis, so we can make some really informed decisions. But yes, for these particular projects, when we went out to ballot, we discussed the different options with our residents, and it was our residents that chose full regeneration. So we hope that, yes, the benefits that we can kind of extract from regeneration, as well as some other carbon assessments, will be able to kind of bring us back to a more carbon neutral future. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. And that point about a whole life kind of business plan, whole life assessment, that picks up on a point that Rafe Bettram from Meridian Water Enfield has brought up, which is a whole life business plan. It sounds great, but it's certainly not easy, and having examples or guidance which accommodates A, the low borrowing rates already available to local authorities, and B, the peak debt that councils are under, and C, the expenditure limitations on revenue projects, and D, the climate risks would be good. So I don't know if the panel has any examples that they want to either bring up here or drop in the chat in response to Rafe's request for examples and guidance which accommodates those things. I will move on now to a specific question from Malcolm. We have a question, Malcolm, and this comes from James Oscan from Landtech, who asks, what examples of structural build type are you considering for the structure of net zero homes?
Yeah, probably my focus tends to be more on the non-domestic side of things, but what I would say is I think for homes it's a similar kind of principle for the commercial properties. I guess our view at this stage is more associated with we're trying to set, if you like, standards and targets, particularly around, for example, net zero, for our supply chain to actually say, okay, you know, we want to achieve these objectives for these properties. And in that sense, we're open to a range of different ideas and options. I mean, I'll give you some examples. I mean, so, you know, we've got projects that we're working on which are using things like passive house. We've also got our own off-site manufacturing processes where, you know, we've certainly got some objectives there where we can actually control off-site fabrication, bring those to site, and take some of those opportunities that we believe exist. But I think, as I say, I think particularly at this time, we're really interested in working with our supply chain, our design teams, to be able to come up with some new ideas and new angles. So the previous question about things like embodied carbon is an interesting one. Where you know, with net zero, obviously there's some really tough targets about achieving embodied carbon standards. Now this is breaking new ground. There's new requirements here, and we want people to really come forward with ideas. And so, you know, having at all projects to have embodied carbon studies and to let people, you know, let them loose and come up with some new angles on that, whether refurb is better or whether demolition is better. So I suppose in that sense, yeah, we're sort of we're not necessarily prescriptive in terms of the specifics around it, and I'm maybe not the best person to comment on that. But what I would say is we're trying to set the kind of principles, the framework that we want people to kind of work within to help us do this, you know, and crack some of this, really, I think.
Great, thank you. Any other panelists want to jump in response to that, or if not, I've got more questions up my sleeves. Okay, great. Let me move on. So I'm really interested in thinking about how the public and the private sector work together. We've got a selection of panelists on both sides of the fence here, and a kind of a question for you all is, how do we ensure that we are all pulling in the same direction? What types of initiatives, legislation, and direction do we need in order to make sure that can happen? Anyone want to jump in there, kick us off with their thoughts on that? Bevan, please go ahead.
I think just, you know, touching on Malcolm's last point, let's take one area, which is kind of residential property. So that's responsible for about 13 to 15% of the UK's emissions. I think what we are starting to get is some clarity over what's needed. And so when someone says net zero, we're starting to understand what that means for that building over there, or that car over there, or that neighbourhood there. I think from a government perspective, what's needed is really, you are going to build to this standard. We expect to see homes or buildings at this standard. Now, that's quite easy to say in a commercial aspect, because there is LEED, there is BREEAM, you can say these things. I think since the Code for Sustainable Homes was got rid of, there's been that fragmentation in the residential construction market, whereby you can just build something that meets the minimum standard. And I think an organisation I previously worked for, we had calculated that every home needs to be around an EPC B, around the middle of an EPC B, for the UK to meet its climate obligations. Now, I think the average home in the UK is an EPC E, something like that. So I think what we're going to have to see from the government is say, well, all new build is going to have to be of this standard, and we're probably getting that in future home standards, maybe. But that prescription, and that's been lacking for a few years. Now, that's in resi markets. Other markets are slightly different. You could talk about automotive in terms of electric vehicles, where there is a lot of mandating going on across lots of different territories, whereby it's going to become easier for car manufacturers to just make an electric car at some point. So if I think about the built environment, resi is where it's at, and just that prescription and coming down in one standard would help to clear a lot of that up, I think.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go to the rest of the panel in a minute. I also just, Bevan, wanted to clarify with you the definition of a stranded asset and how that sits within this broader debate about funding.
So a stranded asset is something essentially which is kind of has a high carbon intensity or high carbon exposure, and which is at risk of getting written down earlier than its lifespan. So let's say an oil refinery, which should have lasted till 2050, may well get an early write down and be closed by 2030 with all its subsequent impacts. So that asset then becomes stranded. And if I'm looking to either invest in that asset or operate that asset or build a new community near that asset because there'll be jobs, I'll have to rethink that. So yeah, that's stranded assets in the most basic definition.
Great, thank you very much, and apologies to the rest of the panel for that slight diversion. Just wanted to make sure I had that checked off. Letitia, I think you had your hand up in response to how the public and private sector can work together.
I think a model that we've seen that works quite well is when the private sector is building these innovative demonstrator projects, particularly around the zero carbon homes. I think the risk sharing profile for the private sector is probably a little bit higher than for the public sector, but then the public sector can innovate in terms of having those economies of scales and standardizing delivery models. So this is what we're seeing in the West Midlands Combined Authority. The private sector has come in and has developed some higher standard housing, not yet to the zero carbon standard, but a lot of passive house sort of models. And now the local authorities can adopt the lessons learned from these schemes to deliver more standardized. And again, it means the homes are maybe not as innovative and as, you know, cutting edge in terms of their design, but they're good high quality homes that have passive design principle and good green spaces. So I think at the bottom of this is really having open source knowledge and being able to share cost uplift, carbon savings, methods that are working, and really across the entire supply chain, because skills is really lacking in terms of delivering these homes.
Thank you. Feliz.
Yeah, I mean, I think the strongest case for private involvement is where there's potential for private benefit, and that's where it all starts, right? That's the easiest way to get the private funding in, and then as Leticia and Bevan were mentioning, you know, we can learn from that, given equitable sharing of data, as well as having functional regulation pointing us all in the right direction. So that is a great place to start. I do think that those issues around bringing in private money into more public benefit projects needs to be carefully thought out in order to have those interactions structured in a way where benefits are still provided for the public good. But, you know, that is something that is a proven model and can be done. It just requires some thinking when we're doing it in the context of what is essentially a moving target, which is our climate, the climate around us, which is going to shift in ways that we get a sense of every year, a little bit better, but also see that there's uncertainties and become more sensitive to those uncertainties over time. So we're essentially planning for a moving target. And in order to set up a financial transaction that is responsive in those conditions is something that we need to work on too.
Great, thank you. Felicity or Malcolm, if you want to jump in, let's go to Felicity first.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was just to say that, you know, we are kind of reliant on a lot of the private sector's sort of expertise in how we approach net zero. So we have a number of different partnerships where we'll be looking to work with the private sector so we could get funds in, helping us to apply for the right funds, helping us to employ the right technologies. But equally, when it comes to redevelopment, we're very well established now at building the right joint venture partners so that they are on board with the net zero ambitions that we have. And we're getting really positive sounds from them that they're also ready to lead this agenda. So yeah, we feel very optimistic about and very fortunate to have great private partnerships that we're already sort of utilising.
Thanks. Malcolm.
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, with my sort of, you know, our landlord, property owner hat on, so we have lots and lots of public sector occupiers, and you know, and some quite big ones. And from our perspective, we're very clear that we have to tackle the carbon emissions associated with all of our properties, and that includes the ones that we're not necessarily we have no management responsibility for. So we want to work with our occupiers, and it touched on the point I made in my slides about occupier engagement. So I think in a very practical way, we see a real opportunity to work with public sector occupiers of ours who've also got some big challenges and targets, in a sense, to collaborate. So, you know, some really practical examples would be things like, you know, how are we going to move some of these buildings from where they are today? What's the roadmap? Where they are today to net zero? Can we sort of develop pilot solutions that we can work with our public sector occupiers? And what the public sector brings in many cases is a kind of long-term view. So, you know, they're long-term occupiers. They're in it for the long term. We're in it for the long term. So there's a real chance to collaborate well together, I think. And that's the sort of areas that we're interested in. I just add as well, I mean, that long-term piece as well, my experience in the past, you know, with public sector as well, is it's a bit like that idea of the exemplars. In some cases, the public sector is quite well placed to help show the way on some of these things because of, as I've said, often these things require, you know, a longer-term perspective, if you like. So I think there's an opportunity there.
Great. We are rapidly moving towards the end of the webinar, and I want to keep to time because I know it's the end of the day for most people, the beginning for Phillies. But one brilliant question from Nick James, Future Ground, that I would love to end on. So just a one-liner response from the panel, if you're able. Nick says, it's 2030, we've achieved net zero for London, hooray! What is the one action in 2020 that was key to making this happen? So Yeah, perhaps a tricky one, but if there's one action that you would, I guess this is fantasy world stuff, perhaps not COVID world stuff, one action that's helped us to achieve net zero by 2030. Go on, let's go for Liz, then Bevan.
Cohesive regulatory standards for net zero.
Great. Bevan.
I would say, and it might sound a bit unusual, but I would start thinking about your offset strategy now and not in 2025 or 2028. So, yeah.
Felicity.
Yeah, so I guess just that clear mandate from central government that they have the strategy and the funding there to support us through the next 10 years to get to 2030.
Malcolm.
Yeah, I think I'm going to, a number of people talked about legislation being the solution. Ideally, that would be great. I think for me, and in the sense of what we're trying to do, I think it's trying to understand what it actually means today. So if we want to get there by 2030, we really need to try to understand what it actually means. And I think, to be frank, you know, there's still a lot to do around that to really get that understanding.
I'll add to my statement, cost of inaction, which I think is adding on to what Malcolm is pointing to there.
You and Letitia.
Mandatory good design, whether that's circular, passive, but just stop building things that are low quality and in the long term will just be bad overall. So whole life system thinking, circular long term, not to repeat the legislation, because that's key to actually build certainty in the sector.
Brilliant. Well, what inspirational, positive notes to end on. So I guess to all of the attendees, let's try and push for those things to be happening in 2020 and not in 2025, as Bevan suggests. We are now running towards the end of the session, and I'm so sorry to everyone who's asked questions that we've not had a chance to get to. And thank you so much for contributing to the chat. I can see there's been loads of information sharing and idea sharing, knowledge exchange. So that's really brilliant to see. If there is anything that Future of London can do to help you connect with anyone else, let us know, and we'll do our best to get those questions answered for you. If we can just go to the final slide of the presentation, I'll let the panelists now turn their videos off and go on mute, and I'll just share with the audience what we've got coming up for, well, the remainder of the week and the remainder of the programme. So tomorrow we have, and it is full, I'm afraid, so if you've not signed up already, I'm afraid you may have missed out, but tomorrow we have a Towards Solutions workshop that is looking specifically at London's green recovery. We're really excited about this. It's an opportunity to move away from the kind of the webinar focused event into something that's a little bit more interactive and discursive, so all attendees at that workshop will be able to share their ideas and their thoughts. So I do hope you've managed to grab yourself a slot. But don't worry if you didn't, or indeed if you missed any of the events on Monday, Tuesday, or well, you wouldn't have missed today's event, you're here, but if you've missed any of the other events this week, on Friday we will be releasing a conference catch-up schedule, and you'll be able to watch all of those events on YouTube, so you won't miss out too much. I'd also like to point you in the direction of an event that we are having on the 19th of November. This is focusing on how public projects can be funded amidst all of the uncertainty that we've been speaking about today. So if you'd like to join us for that on the 19th of November, it's a senior roundtable, and you can check out our website underneath our events tab to find out more info on that. So I think that's about it from me, and all that's left to say is thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you so much to our panelists. It's been a really engaging and varied discussion about the costs of action and the costs of inaction. So I'll let you enjoy your evenings. Bye.